The morning light fell across the Manhattan skyline like liquid gold, painting the glass towers of Caldwell Industries in shades of amber and rose. On the 42nd floor, in an office that costs more to furnish than most people earned in a decade, Ethan Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at a city that feared and admired him in equal measure. He was 33 years old. Young enough that people still called it remarkable. Old enough that he'd stopped caring whether they did. Forbes had placed him on their cover 3 times in 4 years. The Wolf of Wall Street's Next Generation. One headline had read, "The coldest mind in American business," said another. Ethan had framed neither. He didn't need validation from people who only respected what they couldn't touch. His net worth had crossed the $11 billion mark last quarter. His tech conglomerate owned stakes in aerospace, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and pharmaceutical development. He employed over 40,000 people across 19 countries. He had shaped the futures of entire industries with decisions made over coffee that cost $22 a cup. And yet, in the grand, impossible silence of that office every morning, Ethan Caldwell was the loneliest man alive. His mother had died when he was 9. His father, the original Caldwell patriarch, had raised him not with warmth but with expectation, teaching him that emotion was a liability, that vulnerability was a wound the world would exploit. By the time Richard Caldwell Sr. passed away from a heart attack at 61, Ethan had learned the lessons so thoroughly that he hadn't cried at the funeral. Not because he didn't feel it, but because feeling had become something he did in private, in the dark, in the rare moments when exhaustion broke through the fortress he'd spent his entire life constructing. He had no wife. He'd been engaged once, to a woman named Victoria, who was beautiful and sharp and ultimately decided she couldn't love a man who wasn't capable of letting her in. She'd left on a Tuesday morning, leaving behind a note that said, simply, "You are the most impressive empty room I have ever stood in." Ethan had read it 4 times, folded it, placed it in the drawer of his nightstand, and gone to a board meeting an hour later where he'd negotiated a $3 billion acquisition without blinking. He kept the note still. He didn't know why. His personal life was managed the way everything else in his world was managed, with precision and distance. His Upper East Side penthouse was staffed by a small team of household employees who had been with him for varying lengths of time. Marcus, his driver of 6 years, Chef Andre, who had worked for him for 4, and Sophia Reyes, his housekeeper of the past 14 months, who came every weekday morning and left before dinner, quiet and efficient, and entirely invisible to Ethan in the way that all his staff had learned to be. He preferred it that way. He told himself he preferred it that way. What Ethan didn't account for, what no man of his particular emotional architecture ever accounts for, is that life has a way of sending disruption through the smallest possible doors. Sophia Reyes was 28 years old, originally from San Antonio, Texas, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had worked hard all their lives and given their children everything except money. She had studied business administration for 2 years before her scholarship ran dry, had waitressed and cleaned and built a life through sheer determined will, and had been raising her daughter Lucia entirely alone since the child's father had walked out before Lucia was even born. She had taken the housekeeping position at the Caldwell penthouse through a luxury staffing agency, had signed the NDA without hesitation, and had accepted the job with the quiet gratitude of someone who understood that every opportunity was a small miracle. She was not the kind of woman who walked into rooms and turned heads, or rather, she was, but she didn't know it. She had dark eyes that held the particular depth of someone who had survived things and come out still soft on the other side. She laughed easily and genuinely, a sound like warmth, a sound Ethan had heard drifting from the kitchen some mornings when she thought no one was paying attention, and which had, on 3 separate occasions, made him lose his train of thought entirely. But it was Lucia who had first cracked something open in the world of Ethan Caldwell. 3 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's fearlessness, Lucia had arrived at the penthouse for the first time on a Thursday in October when Sophia's childcare had fallen through and she'd had no other option. She had called ahead, apologized twice before Ethan answered, and offered to take a personal day rather than bring her daughter into what she called your space. Ethan had said, in the clipped way he said most things, that it was fine. She could bring the child. He had not expected the child to march directly into his home office 40 minutes later, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, and announce with absolute authority, "Your fish is sad." Ethan had looked up from his laptop. He had looked at the girl. He had looked at the small aquarium in the corner of the room, a decoration his interior designer had installed and which he had genuinely never paid attention to. "Is it?" he said. "Yes," Lucia confirmed gravely. "He needs a friend." "Does he?" "I had a fish once. His name was Pepito. He died because he was lonely." She considered the aquarium with the solemn expertise of a 3-year-old who has known loss. "You should get him a friend before it's too late." Ethan had stared at this child for a long moment. In his world, no one told him what to do. No one walked into his office unannounced. No one spoke to him as though he were simply a person who might benefit from friendly advice about aquarium management. He had felt something move in his chest that he could not immediately name. "I'll think about it," he said. Lucia had nodded, satisfied, and walked back out. 2 hours later, she had returned with a drawing, purple crayon, wildly abstract, and placed it on his desk without a word, then left again. Ethan had looked at the drawing for a full minute. It appeared to be a fish, possibly with wings, possibly accompanied by what might have been a smaller fish, or possibly a potato. He had not thrown it away. He placed it, instead, in the same drawer as Victoria's note. That had been 3 months ago. In the weeks that followed, the rhythms of his household had shifted almost imperceptibly. Sophia continued her quiet, efficient work. Lucia came twice more on days when childcare failed, and each time she found her way to Ethan's office with the directness of someone who had never been taught that some doors were supposed to stay closed to her. Each time, something in Ethan softened by a degree so small it was almost invisible. Almost. He was not a man who recognized love approaching. He had been trained from boyhood to see it as a weakness, and so he had become expert at looking away, at not noticing the way Sophia's voice dropped gentle when she spoke to her daughter, at not counting the mornings he arrived at the kitchen a few minutes earlier than necessary. He was not a man who recognized the edge until he was already falling. And the fall, when it came, would come suddenly, and it would come in the dark, and it would be a 3-year-old girl with a one-eared rabbit who would be the only one in the world who refused to let him go. November in New York has a particular cruelty to it. Not the bone-deep, committed cold of January, but a damp, insidious chill that catches you off guard, that slides under your coat and reminds you that warmth is never guaranteed. It was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November when Ethan Caldwell's carefully constructed world began to crack along its invisible fault lines. The board meeting had run 4 hours over schedule. The deal he'd been engineering for 7 months, a merger that would have created the largest clean energy company in North America, had collapsed at the final hour when the opposing CEO, a man Ethan had considered a professional ally for a decade, had pulled out in favor of a competitor's offer. $20 million and 7 months of work dissolved in 40 minutes of cold negotiation. Ethan had walked out of the conference room with the same expression he wore into every battle, because his face was a strategy too, but his right hand, at his side where no one could see, had been shaking. He had been ignoring a headache since 2 in the afternoon. By 6, it had become something different, a pressure behind his left eye that felt less like tension and more like something structural, something wrong. He had taken 2 ibuprofen and dismissed it as stress. He was Ethan Caldwell. He did not succumb to his body's complaints. His body was simply another system to be managed. Marcus had driven him home in the town car, and Ethan had answered 17 emails on the ride uptown, not because they were urgent, but because stopping meant thinking, and thinking, tonight, felt dangerous. The penthouse was quiet when he arrived. Sophia had left at 6, as always. The evening staff, a rotating security guard and the night cleaner, had come and gone. Chef Andre had left a covered plate in the refrigerator with a handwritten note about reheating instructions that Ethan would not follow. He moved through the grand, silent rooms with the automatic efficiency of a man who has lived alone so long that solitude has become indistinguishable from the architecture itself. He made it as far as his study. The pain arrived without warning, not like a headache anymore, but like a detonation. He reached for the edge of his desk and missed it. The marble floor came up fast. He heard his phone hit the ground somewhere beside him, heard the crack of the screen, heard nothing after that except a high, sustained ringing, and then, underneath it, the sound of his own breathing becoming strange and irregular and terrifyingly unfamiliar. He was alone. He was completely alone. And for the first time in Ethan Caldwell's 33 years of life, that fact was not a preference. It was a sentence. 15 blocks away, Sophia Reyes was giving her daughter a bath. Lucia was at the age where bath time was a serious operation requiring negotiation, staging, and the participation of at minimum 4 rubber animals. Tonight, she had been singing to herself, a made-up song about a purple elephant who was afraid of butterflies, and Sophia had been sitting on the closed toilet seat, phone in one hand, scrolling through a grocery list with the exhausted one-eyed efficiency of a single mother at 8:30 p.m. Then Lucia stopped singing. It was so abrupt that Sophia looked up immediately. Lucia was standing in the tub, still as a painting, her dark eyes wide and fixed on something Sophia couldn't see. "Baby? What's wrong?" "Mr. Ethan is scared," Lucia said. Sophia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bathroom temperature. "What did you say?" "Mr. Ethan." Lucia's small brow furrowed with an expression of deep, earnest concern that 3-year-olds only wear when something has bypassed their rational mind entirely and landed straight in their heart. "He fell down. He needs help." "Lucia, sweetheart." "Mama." Her daughter turned to look at her with those impossible dark eyes, and the word was not a child's ramble. It was a statement. "He needs help right now." Sophia's rational mind said, "She's 3 years old. She's been thinking about him because she saw his fish today in the drawing she made. It's a coincidence. Children say strange things." But Sophia's heart, the part of her that had kept her alive through every hard year, the part that knew things before her mind caught up, her heart was already moving. She was lifting Lucia out of the tub, wrapping her in a towel, reaching for her phone. She called Ethan's cell. It rang out. She called the penthouse landline. It rang out. She stood in her small bathroom in her Queens apartment and told herself she was being irrational. She told herself that Ethan Caldwell had a security team and a driver and a building full of staff who would notice if something was wrong. She told herself she was the housekeeper. She did not have clearance to call his emergency contacts. She did not even know if she had the number for the building's night security desk. "Mama," Lucia said from inside her towel, and her voice was so certain, so completely without drama, that it was more frightening than tears would have been. "Please." Sophia called Marcus. She didn't have a good reason to give him. She said, "I know this sounds strange. I know I have no reason to say this. But something is wrong at the penthouse and I need you to check on him. Please." Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated that it did, but she didn't take it back. Marcus was silent for 2 seconds. Then, I'm 20 minutes away. I'll call building security. Now, Marcus. Please go now. He went. Ethan was found on the study floor 19 minutes later. He was unconscious and unresponsive. Building security called 911 before Marcus reached the room. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes and identified what would later be confirmed at New York Presbyterian Hospital as a hypertensive emergency that had triggered a hemorrhagic stroke, a burst blood vessel in his brain that, had it gone untreated for another hour, would have resulted in catastrophic, irreversible neurological damage. Or death. The attending neurologist would say the word plainly the next morning to the collection of people gathered in the hospital corridor. Ethan's legal team, his business partner Richard Harmon, his assistant Claire, and, in the far corner, quiet and holding her daughter against her chest, Sophia Reyes, who had not been invited but had come anyway because she had not known what else to do. Another hour, the doctor said, and we would not be having this conversation. Richard Harmon, 55 years old, silver-haired, a man who had built half a career on being the most composed person in any room, pressed his hand over his mouth. Claire, 26 and fiercely efficient, turned away and cried silently into her sleeve. Lucia, nestled against Sophia's shoulder, patted her mother's cheek with a small warm hand and said nothing at all. She simply looked toward the closed ICU doors with that same steady, ancient calm she had worn in the bathtub, as though she had known all along how this part of the story went, and had been waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up. Ethan came back to consciousness the way you come back from a very deep ocean, not all at once, not cleanly, but in layers, each one requiring more effort than the last. First there was darkness. Then there was sound, the soft electronic percussion of hospital monitors, the distant murmur of voices, the particular antiseptic smell of a place where people fight for their lives and sometimes lose. Then there was pain. Not acute, not screaming, but a deep and exhausted ache, as though every cell in his body had been negotiating with gravity for days and was only now reporting the terms of the agreement. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was white. He turned his head, slowly, and the world tilted before steadying itself. There was a 4-line in his left hand. There was a monitor beside the bed with a screen he couldn't fully read. There was a window showing a gray November sky, the kind of sky that offers no comfort and makes no promises. He was alive. The fact arrived not with relief, but with a strange, questioning weight. Alive. He held the word in his mind and turned it the way you turn something unfamiliar in your hands, trying to understand the shape of it. Richard Harmon was the first person to come when the nurse notified them he was conscious. He arrived looking 10 years older than he had the last time Ethan had seen him, which had been across a conference table 2 days ago, and he sat in the chair beside the bed and put his face in his hands for a long moment before he looked up. "You're an idiot," Richard said, with the particular gruffness of a man who is using anger because the alternative is weeping. "Noted," Ethan said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped thin. "The doctors said you had a hemorrhagic stroke. Do you know how close?" Richard stopped. Swallowed. Started again. "The building security found you on the floor, Ethan. If they'd been 20 minutes later..." "I know. You don't know. You can't know." Richard leaned forward. "They told me you were essentially bleeding into your brain. They said the window was..." He stopped again. "You have 40,000 employees. You have people who depend on you. You cannot just die alone on your office floor because you won't let anyone close enough to notice you're struggling." Ethan looked at the window. At the gray sky. At nothing. "How did they find me?" he asked because he genuinely didn't know. He had no memory of the fall, no memory of anything after the pain arrived. Richard sat back. He looked at Ethan for a moment with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. "Your housekeeper called Marcus. She said she had a feeling something was wrong." A pause. "She came to the hospital. She's been here, with her little girl." Ethan was quiet. "That child." Richard shook his head slowly. "I don't know how to explain this. Her daughter told her, Ethan. The 3-year-old told her mother, in the middle of bath time, that you had fallen and needed help. The mother called Marcus and he called building security, and that's how they found you." Ethan said nothing for a long time. The monitors beeped their patient, in different rhythm. Outside, a cloud moved and a thin watery light fell through the window and lay across the hospital blanket covering his legs. "A 3-year-old, he said finally. "A 3-year-old, Richard confirmed. The medical team came in then, his neurologist, Dr. Patricia Huang, a precise and serious woman who explained his condition with the measured clarity he would have respected in any other context. The hemorrhage had been contained. There was some residual swelling, which would be monitored. He had been extraordinarily lucky in the timing of his treatment. He would need to remain in the hospital for monitoring, would require medication, lifestyle modification, follow-up imaging. He would recover, fully in all likelihood if he was careful. He had been running his blood pressure at catastrophic levels for, she estimated, at least 2 years. She said this the way doctors say things they have been professionally trained not to say with fury, but the fury was there underneath it, restrained and precise. She told him that his body had been sending him warnings he had systematically overridden. She told him that the human body was not a machine and that the belief that it was had nearly killed him. He listened. He said yes and understood in all the appropriate places. And when she left, he lay alone in the white room and stared at the ceiling and felt something move through him that he had not felt since he was 9 years old, and they had told him his mother wasn't coming home. It was grief. Not for what he had lost, not yet, but for what he had been spending his whole life building, and the sudden, terrible suspicion that he had been building in entirely the wrong direction. They let him have visitors in the afternoon. Richard came back briefly. Claire came with a folder of things she thought he'd want to know. He sent her home and told her it could wait, and her surprise at this was more revealing than she knew. His attorney came and was similarly dismissed. He asked the nurse, almost as an afterthought, almost as though it didn't matter. "The woman who's been waiting. Sophia Reyes. Can she come in?" The nurse said she'd check. Sophia appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later. She was still wearing her coat, the practical gray wool one she wore every morning to the penthouse, and her dark hair was pulled back and her eyes were red-rimmed in the careful way of someone who has been crying intermittently for 15 hours and has been trying to make sure no one notices. She had Lucia on her hip, the child's one-eared rabbit dangling from one small fist. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him, and the look on her face was something Ethan had never, in his 33 years of being looked at, had anyone direct at him. It was not admiration. It was not professional deference. It was not attraction or awe or the particular calculation of someone looking at his net worth. It was relief, pure and unguarded and real. The kind of relief that only exists on the other side of genuine fear. "You're awake," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. "I'm awake," he said. Lucia looked at him from her mother's arms with her ancient, solemn dark eyes. Then she held out her rabbit, extending it toward him across the hospital room with the absolute, unquestioning generosity that only very young children and very old souls possess. "He'll keep you safe," she said. "He kept me safe when I was scared." Ethan Caldwell, who had not cried at his father's funeral, who had read Victoria's devastating note 4 times without flinching, who had built $11 billion on the architecture of his own impenetrability, felt his throat close completely, felt the hot, unfamiliar pressure build behind his eyes, felt something in him, some old and load-bearing wall, begin to give. He reached out and accepted the rabbit. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was barely sound at all. Lucia nodded. Business concluded. She rested her head on her mother's shoulder and looked at him with complete and uncomplicated satisfaction, and Ethan understood, for the first time in longer than he could remember, what it felt like to be seen. Recovery, Ethan discovered, was not a straight road. It was not a boardroom negotiation with a clear outcome. It was not a quarterly projection or a market analysis. It was unpredictable and humbling, and it required, above all else, the willingness to accept help, which was, of all the things he had ever been asked to do, the hardest. He spent 8 days in the hospital. He was released into a world that had continued turning without him, which he had intellectually always known but had never quite felt in his bones. His assistant Claire had managed the company communications with impressive efficiency. Richard had handled the board. The 40,000 employees had continued doing their jobs without needing him to personally hold the weight of every decision. The world, irritatingly, had not collapsed. He went home to the penthouse, which felt different now in ways he couldn't articulate. Larger, maybe. Or maybe what it felt was what it had always been, empty, and he was only now willing to call it that. He had been advised to rest. He had been prescribed 3 medications, a dietary overhaul, and regular monitoring. He had been told, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that he could not return to full work capacity for a minimum of 6 weeks. This information had produced, in the first 48 hours, a restlessness in him so acute it felt physical, the withdrawal of a man who had used work as both armor and anesthetic for decades, suddenly stripped of both. On the 3rd morning home, Sophia arrived at her usual time. He had half expected her not to come, expected that the intimacy of the hospital room had been a situational anomaly, that they would reset to the professional distance that had always defined their arrangement. But she arrived at 8, as always, hung her gray coat in the hall closet, and moved into the kitchen to make coffee, and the ordinariness of it, the absolute, beautiful ordinariness, made him feel something loosen in his chest. He came to the kitchen. This was unusual. He normally took his coffee in the study. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the kitchen counter, and everything that had happened in the past 8 days sat between them like a living thing. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Better," he said. And then, because he was trying, because the hospital had cracked him open enough to let in a little honesty, scared. Still a little scared. Sophia nodded. "That makes sense," she said, without drama, without excessive sympathy, in the calm way of a woman who understood that sometimes the truest kindness was simply to receive what someone offers without making it bigger or smaller than it is. "Lucia," he said, "she told you. That night." "Yes." How did she know? Sophia was quiet for a moment, hands wrapped around her own coffee mug. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've asked myself that 100 times. She's always been." She paused, choosing words carefully. "She feels things. Deeply. People. She felt you from the first day she came here. She talks about you at home." A brief, self-conscious pause. "I hope that isn't inappropriate. What does she say?" A small, soft smile moved across Sophia's face, the real one, not the professional one. She says you're lonely. She said it the first day. She looked at him. She said you needed a friend, like the fish. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happens between people who have arrived, without planning it, at a moment of complete honesty. She was right, Ethan said. Lucia began coming to the penthouse more regularly. Not every day. Sophia continued to maintain the professional parameters of their arrangement, but on the days when the childcare situation was uncertain, she came, and on those days, the penthouse was different. It was full of sound. It was full of questions about things Ethan had never been asked. Why is the sky darker on that side? Can fish hear music? If you're very, very rich, why is your apartment so quiet? He answered every question. Some he didn't know the answer to, which Lucia found both surprising and acceptable. That's okay, she told him seriously, about his inability to explain why clouds had different shapes. You know other things. He bought a second fish for the aquarium. He and Lucia named it together. She chose Marigold because she had seen the word on a seed packet in a magazine and liked the way it sounded. He discovered that choosing a name for something small and living, in consultation with a 3-year-old who took the responsibility extremely seriously, was among the most meaningful things he had done in recent memory. He started talking to Sophia. Not the transactional exchanges they'd had for 14 months. Actual conversation. It began cautiously, questions about Lucia, about how she was sleeping since the hospital incident, whether the child had been frightened or disturbed by whatever she had felt that night. Then it expanded, the way real conversation does when two people discover each other's depth, slowly, with growing surprise. He learned that Sophia had been accepted to finish her business degree 3 years ago and had deferred, then let the enrollment lapse, because single motherhood hadn't left room. He learned that she was, underneath the practicality and the quiet efficiency, extraordinarily perceptive about people, that she had a gift for reading situations, reading rooms, reading the subtext beneath what people said and what they meant. He learned that she laughed from somewhere deep and real, and that when she did, it rearranged the atmosphere in whatever room she was standing in. He told her things he had not told anyone, about his mother, about what his father had taught him and what it had cost, about Victoria's note, which he had kept but never fully understood until now, about the board meeting the day of his stroke, the deal that fell apart, and how he had known, somewhere beneath his pride, that he had been trying to fill a silence with success, and it had never worked, and he had kept trying anyway. Sophia listened. She did not rush to fix or reassure. She listened the way very few people know how to listen, with her whole self, with patience, with the willingness to sit inside someone else's truth without immediately trying to improve it. "You've been so alone," she said one afternoon, quietly, without pity. "Yes," he said. And it was the first time in his life that the word felt like a beginning rather than an ending. He was falling. He knew he was falling. He had felt the first tremor weeks ago and had told himself it was gratitude, a reasonable response to someone who had helped save his life. He had told himself it was the intimacy of his vulnerability, that he was misreading proximity for connection. He had marshaled all the rational arguments, all the structural protections, all the careful architecture of a man who had been keeping his own heart under management for 3 decades. But Lucia had given him her rabbit on the first day, and something had come down that he was not able to rebuild. And Sophia looked at him like he was a person, just a person, not an empire or a symbol or a net worth, and he had been so starved for that particular look that it was remaking him from the inside. He was falling. And for the first time in his life, he was not looking away. December arrived with the first real snow of the season, and New York became, briefly, the version of itself that people who have never lived there imagine all the time, clean and white and hushed, The hard edges of the city softened under an inch of fresh fall. The streets momentarily returned to something resembling grace. It was a Saturday. Sophia was not scheduled to work. She had brought Lucia in for a doctor's appointment on the Upper East Side that morning, her daughter's annual checkup, and on an impulse she had not examined too carefully, she had texted Ethan afterward to ask how he was feeling. He had responded in 60 seconds, which was faster than any professional communication had ever required, and had asked if Lucia had ever seen Central Park in the snow. She had not. An hour later, they were there. It was not a romantic outing in any formal sense. It was a 33-year-old man in an expensive coat that was entirely unsuitable for actual outdoor activity, and a 28-year-old woman in her practical gray wool, and a 3-year-old in a red snowsuit who immediately abandoned all dignity to throw herself face-first into the nearest snowbank with the unrestrained commitment that only toddlers and the truly free can access. Ethan stood at the edge of the path and watched Lucia explode out of the snowbank, covered from forehead to boot in white, laughing with her whole body, and the sound of her laughter moved through him like something his own life had been missing so long he'd forgotten to mourn the absence of it. "She has no fear," he said. "None," Sophia agreed beside him. "It's terrifying. It's also the best thing I've ever seen." They walked. Lucia ran ahead and circled back, a small red figure pinballing between trees and benches, narrating her own adventure in a steady stream of 3-year-old commentary. The park was not empty. It was New York, and New York was never empty, but it felt private, somehow, the way that snow makes its own kind of silence. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, "about what happens when I go back. To work, to all of it." He looked straight ahead, into the white park. "I've been running for 20 years. I've been building things and acquiring things and measuring things, and I told myself it was purpose. That it was enough." He was quiet a moment. "It wasn't enough. What would be?" Sophia asked. She was not steering. She was genuinely asking. "This," he said, simply, and the word cost him something. He could feel it leaving him, the last of his careful distance, but the cost was one he was finally willing to pay. "Something like this. Something real." He turned to look at her. "Someone who looks at me the way you do. Like I'm just a person who is allowed to be tired. Allowed to need things." A pause. "I've never had that." Sophia held his gaze. Around them, the park continued its gentle, snow-muffled life. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I am your employee. I know. And our situations are." She gestured, a small, expressive gesture that covered the distance between his 11 billion and her queen's apartment. "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to ignore any of that. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just telling you the truth, because I've spent 33 years not doing that, and it almost killed me." He held her gaze. "You are extraordinary. What you did that night, what Lucia did, you saved my life. Not just biologically. You cracked something open that I didn't know how to crack myself." A breath. "I'd like to know you. Really know you. If you'd be willing." For a long moment, Sophia said nothing. The snow fell lightly around them, and Lucia could be heard somewhere nearby, engaged in what sounded like a heated negotiation with a pigeon. Then Sophia said, "I have a daughter. I know. I also know she gave me her rabbit in a hospital room and told me he'd keep me safe." His voice was rough with something he didn't try to hide. "I'm aware that she is a force of nature. I would not have it any other way." Sophia looked at him for a long time, with those dark eyes that held everything she'd survived and was still carrying, and Ethan held still under the weight of that look and did not flinch from it, because he was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with all the graceless earnestness of a man who has never been taught how. He was learning that being seen was not the same as being destroyed. Okay, she said finally. Quietly. We go slow. As slow as you want, he said. Mama. Lucia appeared around a bend at full speed, snow-covered and magnificent, one mitten on and one mitten gone. Mama, the pigeon took my mitten. The pigeon. He carried it, Mama. He carried it in his beak. Ethan looked at Sophia. Sophia looked at Ethan. And they both started laughing, really laughing, the kind that catches you by surprise and runs all the way through you, the kind that leaves you breathless and lighter and more genuinely yourself than you were 10 seconds before. Lucia regarded them both with the patient dignity of a child whose emergency is not being taken seriously. It's not funny, she informed them. You're right, Ethan managed. I'll get you a new mitten. A blue one, Lucia specified because she had standards. Blue, he confirmed. Lucia considered this acceptable and ran back toward the pigeon situation. Ethan and Sophia stood in the snow, still catching their breath, shoulders almost touching, and the city went on around them, loud and alive and completely indifferent. The way cities are, the way life is, and it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect, because they were in it together. He bought her a blue mitten from a street vendor on Central Park West. Lucia wore it with great ceremony the entire subway ride back to Queens, where Ethan rode, slightly bewildered by public transit, next to a 3-year-old who fell asleep on his arm somewhere between 72nd and 59th Street and did not wake up until they reached their stop, at which point she blinked up at him with no apparent self-consciousness and said, "You're warm." "Thank you," he said. "Like a radiator," she added thoughtfully. He rode the subway back uptown alone, sitting in the same seat, and he was smiling. He was just smiling, by himself, on the New York City subway, like an ordinary man on an ordinary Saturday who had spent the day in the park and was heading home with something warm still radiating in the middle of his chest. He had been, without knowing how, brought back to life. Spring came to New York the way it always does, sudden and not entirely trustworthy, a few warm days followed by a cold snap followed by a morning when you wake up and the air is different, genuinely different, and you know something has turned. Ethan noticed spring that year in a way he had not noticed it in a decade because he had spent too many springs looking at it through the glass of the 42nd floor, and now he was in it, walking through it, feeling it. He had, over the 4 months since his stroke, made a set of decisions that had startled everyone who worked for him and surprised no one who was paying the right kind of attention. He had restructured his schedule. Where he had once worked from 6 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night without pause, he now maintained genuine limits, not because productivity had suffered, but because he had discovered, with some wonder, that rested focus produced better decisions than exhausted performance. He had promoted 3 people he had been underutilizing because his own need to control everything had kept them in insufficient roles. He had called off 2 acquisitions that were strategically sound but ethically murky and had redirected the capital toward his company's clean energy division, which had needed the investment for years. He had called Richard Harmon into his office one afternoon and told him that he wanted to build something that would still matter in 50 years. Not financially, actually matter. Richard had sat across from him and listened with the expression of a man watching someone he cared about rediscover something they'd lost, and at the end he had said, "I've been waiting for you to come back to this version of yourself for a very long time." Ethan hadn't known there had been another version. Or rather, he had known and had believed it wasn't survivable. He was learning otherwise. He and Sophia had gone slowly. They had honored that word, that commitment, with the seriousness it deserved. There had been dinners, first, quiet ones, in restaurants where no one knew him well enough to stare, then in her apartment in Queens where she cooked the San Antonio recipes her mother had taught her, and Lucia sat at the table and held court and provided opinions on every dish with the unsolicited confidence of a professional food critic. He had met her parents over video call in February, which was the most genuinely nervous he had been since. He couldn't remember. Since ever, Possibly. Her mother, Maria, had looked at him with sharp, warm eyes and asked him not what he was worth but what he valued, and he had answered honestly, and she had not smiled immediately, but 15 minutes later, without fanfare, she had told Sophia in Spanish that she thought he was sincere. Sophia had translated this for him afterward, her eyes bright. He was learning. He was learning the rhythms of a life that had other people in it, real people, not staff or employees or business partners, but people who needed things from him that weren't professional or financial. He was learning that Lucia had nightmares sometimes, and that the aftermath of a nightmare required patience and the specific voice of someone who is not frightened themselves. He was learning that Sophia was fiercely proud and would not accept gifts that felt like charity, and that the boundary between generosity and condescension was one he had to learn to navigate with care. He made mistakes. He apologized. He tried again. He was learning apology. He was learning try again. These were not things that had been in his vocabulary before. They were not nothing. In March, he made a decision about the fish. He and Lucia expanded the aquarium. This was done as a Saturday project, with considerable ceremony, involving a trip to the pet store in which Lucia personally interviewed multiple fish before selecting 3 new additions. The aquarium now held 6 fish. Lucia had named them all. Marigold, the original. Then Thunderbolt, Princess, Steve, Watermelon, and a small spotted one called Dr. Fancy because, in Lucia's estimation, he appeared distinguished. Dr. Fancy was Ethan's favorite, which he did not admit out loud. In April, on a Wednesday evening when Lucia was at her grandmother's for the week and Sophia had agreed to dinner in the penthouse, Ethan cooked. He was not a skilled cook. Chef Andre had been diplomatically horrified when Ethan had told him he wanted to learn, but he had been practicing, and the chicken marsala he produced was, if not refined, at least genuine. He had set the table himself, which took 3 tries because he had genuinely not been sure where the forks went, and had placed, in the center, a small arrangement of tulips that were yellow and slightly imperfect. Sophia arrived. She saw the table. She saw the tulips. She stood in the dining room of the most expensive apartment she had ever stood in, and her face moved through several things at once. And then she said, "You cooked." "I attempted to cook," he corrected. "There's a distinction, Ethan." "I know it's not." "Stop," she said gently. She walked to the table and touched one of the tulips, and then she turned around and looked at him with those dark eyes that had undone him from nearly the beginning, and she said, "This is the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me. It's imperfect chicken marsala and drugstore tulips." "Yes," she said. "That's why." He understood. She was not a woman who could be bought with grand gestures. She was a woman who could be reached by someone who put real hands into something imperfect because the imperfection itself was the proof that it mattered. They ate dinner, and they talked, and the city glittered outside the windows like a thing that had been waiting patiently all along to be part of a story that meant something. Later, when the plates were cleared and they were sitting at the table with wine neither of them was fully drinking, he said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay," she said. "I've been thinking about what Lucia did that night. I've been thinking about it for months, and I don't have a rational explanation for it, and I've made peace with not having one." He turned his glass in his hand. "But I think I understand something about it that I didn't before." "What's that?"
"She saw me," he said.
"The way very small children do, before they learn not to. She came into my office on that first day, and she saw a fish that was lonely, and she saw a man who was lonely, and she treated both things with the same practical, serious compassion." He looked at Sophia. "She learned that from you. That way of seeing people. Of not looking past them. You did that for me too. Long before the hospital." Sophia was quiet. "I was invisible in my own life," he said. "And you both, you made me visible again. You made me matter to myself."
That is, he stopped, composed himself, started again.
I don't know how to say this without it sounding insufficient.
Try, she said.
I love you, he said. I love you, and I love your daughter, and I love the life that I can see from here. The one that's fish named Dr. Fancy and blue mittens and you cooking things in my kitchen and Lucia asking me questions I can't answer. And I want that life. I choose that life. Not the empire. Not the 42nd floor. This. The silence that followed was the longest and the fullest and the most honest silence of his 33 years. Then Sophia reached across the table and took his hand. We choose it back, she said. Both of us. 2 months later, on a June morning when the city was warm and the park was green and Lucia was running ahead of them on the path with her arms outstretched like she was trying to gather the whole world into herself, Ethan Caldwell walked beside Sophia Reyes and felt, for the first time in his life, that the most important thing he had ever built was not a company, not a legacy, not a tower of glass and steel 42 stories above the earth. It was this. Exactly this. A woman who saw him. A child who had refused to let him disappear into the dark alone. A morning in the park that cost nothing and meant everything. He had fallen once on a study floor in November, and the world had declared him unlikely to survive. His doctors had been uncertain, his board had been shaken, his business partners had been afraid, and the people who wrote about him in magazines had quietly begun composing the retrospectives. But a 3-year-old girl in a bath time moment, in a Queens apartment 15 blocks away, had known something that none of them had accounted for. Had felt something that no rational system could explain, through whatever mysterious and generous capacity the very young and the very loving possess, that bridge between hearts that adults spend their whole lives building walls against. She had known he was there. She had known he was falling. And she had sent her mother to him, the way you send the most important thing you have into the world when someone needs it. Lucia raced back to them now, slightly out of breath, one shoe untied, eyes bright. Ethan, she said, with the gravity of important news. There's a dog over there, and he's enormous. How enormous! She spread her arms as wide as they would go. He took her hand in his left, and Sophia's hand in his right. Show me, he said. And they went, the 3 of them, into the morning who had known, with the whole uncomplicated certainty of a child's heart, that some people are worth saving, and that love, when it is real, does not wait for permission to act. The end.